Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election season is underway, and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for re-election due to term limits, many new office holders are being elected. New Yorkers are not only electing a new class of office holders, but the next roster of leadership for the city in a moment of crisis. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city controller, new borough presidents, and many new city council members. There are some incumbents that are eligible and seeking re-election, and there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney and even more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election in the fall will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections with both early voting and the new ranked choice voting system, which applies to party primaries and special elections only, and we'll explain that at length in a separate show. The city election cycle would be of enormous importance under even usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at this time of great crisis for the city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. The new wave of city leadership will, quite clearly, make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on health, jobs, families, housing, education, and more. So we're pleased to bring you this new series of interviews with the candidates running for mayor of New York City, as well as other candidates for office. These one-on-one conversations will help you get to know the candidates better, learn about their backgrounds and platforms, and their vision for the future of our city. We hope this and other interviews will help you sort through your many choices and make a very informed decision when it's time to vote. So on to today's conversation. Joining me now by Zoom is Dianne Morales, who is a Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City. Dianne, thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see you.
So we're going to get into lots in this conversation, but why don't you give folks a little bit of an overview of your background, your resume, who you are, where you come from?
Sure. So I'm first generation Puerto Rican. I was born and raised in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, to working class family. My dad was a union worker and my mom was actually a secretary at a leather workers union that no longer exists, I don't think. I'm also the single mother of two college students who are home these days. But they both went through the public school system. My daughter, actually, Gabriela, is a sexual assault survivor who struggles with mental health challenges. And my son's been racially profiled multiple times. And most recently, in the beginning of the protest this summer, was assaulted by the NYPD. I feel like I have a firsthand lived experience with some of the inequities and disparities in the city on the education front, the mental health front, and certainly in policing. And as a woman of color, those experiences combined with my professional experiences as an executive of organizations that have fought really to help people overcome the systemic and structural barriers to access and opportunity, I think are a unique combination and have given me a unique perspective on some of the challenges that we're facing in the city. And that's essentially why I decided to jump into this race. I think that I've got a unique perspective, and I think it's time for us to really have the sort of moral and political courage to confront some of those deeply rooted issues and make the changes that we need to make over the long term that are really going to benefit everybody.
So we'll get to some of the thoughts on those changes in just a minute. First, I think it'd be great for folks to hear a little bit more about that professional experience. I also just wanted to say I'm sorry about what you shared about both your children and wishing them the best.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I have to say that, I have spent quite a bit of time with both of them individually, just making sure that it was okay with them, that I share their stories. It's so inextricably linked with who I am and why I'm doing this. But it's also one of those things that I recognize, they needed to be okay with. And I've gotten both their consent, and they both feel strongly about my doing this.
That's good for people to know as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So on the professional front, I've had almost 30 years of experience, running programs and providing services. I think 26 years ago, I was part of a team that founded a national organization called Jumpstart. It's an early childhood literacy organization that really worked to sort of bolster literacy development skills in preschool kids, low income communities of color, and primarily where we know there's a language deficit that starts as early as 18 months. And the cool thing about that program was that the way we did that work was to pair college students, to train and pair college students to push into classroom settings and preschool settings to help bolster those literacy skills. And in doing that, we were also creating a pipeline to education with those college students by providing them with a child development associate, which is a credential that's recognized in the early childhood field. So I was responsible for actually creating the national infrastructure to build that organization. And we also worked closely at that time with the Clinton administration. I'm going to date myself a little bit, to create the America Reads legislation, which is in fact what allows college work study students to participate in AmeriCorps as part of national service. So that's sort of like the long-term thing. Locally, I've done things like to develop a model in after-school programs that was adopted by the Department of Youth and Community Development. And so now every after-school program in the city actually has the same model, and that is an education specialist, which was a specific role that we created. And I also, in my most recent career, in the last decade in the South Bronx, created a cross-sector partnership program that provided training in the healthcare field for people that were underemployed or unemployed. And that was in partnership with Montefiore Medical Center and Hostos Community College. And that program has, exceeded national averages in terms of retention and promotion for the graduates that were successful.
And so in that work you did, that's workforce development. Other areas that your work touched on?
Workforce development, education, overcoming the sort of, the achievement gap, as they call it. Supportive housing. I've developed and operated supporting housing programs for some of, homeless people with the most severe and persistently mental illness conditions, with substance abuse. And also the sort of the last thing I did before leaving was to create housing for young people who were homeless, aging out of foster care, and also struggling with mental illness.
So what's at the root of some of these issues that you've been working on? What is the sort of systemic roots of it all that need to be yanked up and replanted? When we talk about the achievement gap, when we talk about those early gaps in literacy, what's at the root there in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of talk these days about the social determinants of health, right? Living in poverty and the different sort of conditions that exposes one to that have a negative impact on mental health, on physical health, on academic achievement, on economic opportunity, right? The disparities in wages between women and men, the disparities in wages between, the white counterparts and people of color. All of those things are sort of systemic and structural, and then have these like compounding effects on people's lives and their ability to live in dignity and to provide for their families. And so, I really think that it's time for us to kind of really be honest with ourselves and reflect on these issues and make a commitment to start addressing those things as opposed to the symptoms that arise as a result of those things. And we have an unprecedented opportunity here. As hard as this year has been, and I don't want to downplay that at all, we also have an unprecedented opportunity with all of the things you talked about in your opening about the turnover and the number of people that we can elect into office. We have an opportunity to really kind of like put a stake in the ground around, we're not going to elect people who are just going to tinker around the edges or who are going to roll out a new Band-Aid. We want people who are actually committed to digging deep, digging into these hard issues. but recognizing that there's a collective interdependence, and we all do better when the people that, run our city do better.
Give us a couple of examples of sort of more concretely what that would look like. Let's say you're mayor, and let's say you get a city council that's like-minded that you can work with, or that you can cajole to follow your vision because you'll have a mandate.
Yeah.
What are a couple of examples of what folks can sort of sink their teeth into to understand what that would look like?
Sure. So one of the phrases I've been using lately is like flipping the model on its head, right? So let's talk about the economy, right? There's this notion that's been perpetuated around the idea that in order for us to come back economically, we need big corporations and big companies to come into the city and save us. But the reality of it is 50% of New Yorkers are employed by small and mid-sized businesses, right? So we could choose to go invest in the 50% that the big corporations would employ, or we could choose to prioritize local folks and support local small and mid-sized businesses first by providing them with the tax incentives, by providing them with the grants and subsidies and the small or no interest loans. And getting that 50% of the population back to work, right? Which then, we know if people go back to work, they're going to start investing in the economy, and that's how we start to revive and revitalize things. It's just a different model, right? We're prioritizing a different group in that. We could say the same thing for housing. The housing industry in New York City has been profit driven. And what if we in fact decided first that we were going to prioritize community ownership and social housing and cooperative housing and community land banks? It's the same investments, just targeted differently, and prioritizing and centering people in the city first.
And so on housing, let's talk a little bit more about that, because pre-pandemic, during pandemic, hopefully there's a post, pandemic that's not too far off. This is a crisis. It takes different shape. It gets more severe during these times, and people facing potentially a wave of evictions, although we don't know what policies might be put in place or funding that might come through. But what's the larger sort of way to think about housing in 2022 and beyond for years, a long-term sort of housing plan directed by City Hall? Because we've seen Mayor de Blasio's housing plan, big ambitious number of units and affordable, and use market rate to help fund affordable. What's the Dianne Morales vision on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll say two things first. One is that, you alluded to it. The housing crisis existed long before the pandemic, right? The pandemic has just really exacerbated that and made it so much harder. And so that goes to the issue of the root, right? It's not enough to sort of deal with just the pandemic. We've got to deal with the root of things. That being said, we also have to deal with the pandemic and the sort of the extent to which that has, exponentially exacerbated things. And so, focusing on figuring out providing rent relief to tenants, because the majority of New Yorkers are in fact tenants. But doing that in such a way that still protects the small homeowners. I'm very concerned about the mom and pop folks, the grandmas. And I fall into that category, right? I own one home and I have one tenant. And so, and it's all I got, right? So, I'm all for providing tenant relief. And also I want to be able to, from a wealth building perspective, recognize that for many people, many low income Black and brown people, the only access that they have to wealth building is through home ownership.
Right. We don't want another foreclosure crisis.
And so, right. So we have to make sure we take care of that. That's the immediate. I think from the longer term perspective, it goes to, some of what I was referencing before in terms of really what do we need to do to build people's ability the community's ability to self-determine. How do we look at all of the vacancies that have, sprouted up across the city, either as a result of the pandemic or prior, because folks are sitting on vacant apartments or vacant land waiting for the values to go up and benefiting from tax deductions as a result of that. I think we need to think about those things. We need to look at how we can repurpose things. Would you think about the vacant storefronts? Let's be creative. Let's be innovative. Let's not be beholden to the old rules that actually helped to create this problem to begin with.
Are you thinking more about public-private partnerships? Are you thinking about a city government that's doing a whole lot more and not really trying to work that closely with, the larger, let's say, players on the private market? How are you thinking about how that happens, and does it necessitate a big influx of money from taxes on the wealthy to support it?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about what I would consider public-private partnerships, but I'm thinking about shifting the balance of power, essentially, right? Such that the community has more power, and the community has sort of like a critical role in decision making, as opposed to a superficial or symbolic role. That a process that's not, everybody should be at the table. We all have some skin in the game, right? We're all stakeholders in this, and that includes developers. I'm not saying that, that my administration would block out that participation or that voice. It's just about shifting the proportion of influence and impact that those voices have. And I think developers have, they have a stake in the idea of housing being successful in New York City. And maybe it means reducing their profit or their tax incentives, so that that money is going and being directed into the community instead. To your point about the influx of revenue, one of the things we're looking at is a land value tax, as opposed to, or in addition to, property taxes, right? There are, my understanding, and I'm admittedly an early student of this, is that adopting a land value taxation model would actually, in fact, generate quite a bit of revenue for the city. And then the last thing I'll say on this, because I could go on, is that I also think we need to look at the money that we do control and that we do have in the city budget. I don't believe is always used as effectively or efficiently as it could be. And that would certainly be one of the first things that I would look at before any of these other things.
What are we wasting money on, do you think, or how is money being ill spent? A huge portion of the city budget is personnel. There's massive personnel costs, and under Mayor de Blasio, the city payroll has grown quite a bit. And he said, these are good jobs. These are government jobs doing services. I'm fine with that. But that's one chunk. But where do you think money is being wasted in city government?
Yep. So that is one chunk. I think you're right about that. And they are good jobs, and the ones that are filled are fine. There's also a lot of vacancies in those departments, those city departments, and that money gets tied up in those budgets, whether it's vacant, the position is vacant or not. So my kind of thing on that is like, if that position's been vacant for more than 6 months, maybe you don't need it. And maybe we need to look at reclaiming those dollars and reallocating them elsewhere. And then, the other thing, the most bloated sort of budget in this city is the Department of, the NYPD. And I've talked about that publicly, about what I think, the idea that I feel like we need to divest and reinvest. And that sort of would be one of my first priorities, to take a really hard look at that budget. I've talked about creating a community first responders department instead of that, but I think that there's other fat that could be trimmed there as well. So I think there's a lot in terms of the city budget. I think there's a lot in terms of contracts with consultants, consultants that get paid a lot of money to create a really, really big, heavy paper, like holders, whatever those things are called, like, yeah, they just sit on the shelves, right? And I'm not sure that that's the best use of our money, particularly in the middle of this crisis. So I would really, really take a fine-tooth comb to the budget.
There's roughly 35 to 36,000 uniformed NYPD officers, another 15,000 civilian employees at the NYPD. Do you have a ballpark, a sense of what you'd want those numbers to look like in your re-envisioning of a community safety department? Is the number of uniformed officers carrying guns going from 35,000 to 10,000? I mean, do you have a sense of that yet, or have you not gotten under the hood enough?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've been thinking about it more in terms of just sort of total bottom line for the budget of the city. And I think so, just to be clear, right, this isn't snap your finger or like flip a switch kind of thing. I think there needs to be a progressive sort of reallocation. The first hit would probably be the hardest hit, right? In terms of just, it's also reflective of a culture shift and decreasing the budget. And I think, I think we had called for first $1 billion and then $5 billion. So, starting there, because I think the thing that has to happen at the same time is the ramping up of the community first responders department, and doing that in a way that is responsive to community needs and actually sets up that department to be successful by providing it with the resources that it needs.
How is 2 or 3 billion, let's say, of the NYPD? The NYPD has a roughly $6 billion annual operating budget. There's several billion other dollars that are devoted to NYPD expenses. But how does 2 or 3 billion dollars of money currently going to the NYPD better spent? What would you spend that money on in your new vision for public safety?
Yeah, so I would, I think we know that the majority actually of the calls that the NYPD responds to are not crimes. They are, issues related to some of those social determinants of health that I was talking about earlier, right? The homelessness, mental health, and behavioral health issues. And so the idea of creating a team of professionals, of skilled and trained people who are able to intervene and de-escalate those types of situations. And not only that, but also then connect those people to services and programs will both save lives, because who wants to send an armed person to, intervene in a case with someone who's having a mental health breakdown. But it will also connect those people to something more, right? And so we want to intervene in a way that's not just de-escalating, but also allows for people to be connected to something that's going to help prevent that situation from reoccurring. And that's where I think those dollars really need to be spent.
Let's talk a little bit about education, a little bit more about education, I should say, since we started off on that a little bit. How do you think about addressing the challenges in the school system that have been embedded for decades now? And there have been different mayoral approaches, that have made, again, some impact. Clearly, graduation rates have risen, et cetera, et cetera. But you talked a lot about sort of radically rethinking a lot of what the city does, and the biggest chunk of the city budget in terms of departments is the Department of Education, educating 1 million students plus. So what are you thinking about there in terms of how to reimagine and get some real differences in results?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say on that is, we've got an affinity group called Educators for Dianne. They're, a citywide group of people who are struggling right now with the challenges. And they've been critical in sort of helping, I obviously had my thoughts and ideas about this, but they've been critical in helping me to formulate my thinking around it. I'm also really sensitive to the fact that the Department of Education has been sort of subjected, perhaps more than any other entity in the city, to a radical overhaul, radical shifts and changes. But there are things that we need to tackle. And one of the things I feel like we've missed at this moment in time is specifically the opportunity to think about how we desegregate virtual classrooms. As much as going virtual has presented challenges, had we been thoughtful and really planful in a different kind of way to first make sure that all of our students had access to the technology and infrastructure that they need, we could have begun to experiment with desegregating classrooms. There's no reason why the best teacher from the Upper East Side couldn't have had a student from Brownsville and a student from Jamaica, Queens, and a student from the South Bronx in their classrooms, had we sort of taken the time to think that through and plan for that. So I think that's a missed opportunity, and I'm hoping that the city will catch on to that at some point, because I think parents are actually willing to try just about anything these days because they're feeling so desperate. But the other thing,
parents who have the resources, are parents who have the advantages, are they willing to try anything these days?
Well, that's an interesting question. But the parents who have the resources are a really small percentage of the overall student population. And I think, if I'm going to center my agenda on equity and justice, I have to first center the families that don't have the resources. And I think obviously there needs to be conversation and education and bringing along of people who might take issue with that. But I do think that there's a general openness. I do think, the parents that have the resources but are still participating in the public school system, there's a reason for that, right? There is something that they believe in. And I think tapping into that idea of what a public school system is supposed to offer, and the idea of working to get New York City to really be the best public school system in the country, is something that people could buy into. And now is the time, because I do think people are more open to experimenting with things. It's just there's a need for clarity and leadership that's been missing also.
Is desegregating the city schools a top priority for, again, let's just sort of say 2022, you're taking office and, school is sort of back to how it was, people can go 5 days, et cetera. Is desegregating the city schools a top priority, and how do you get it? If it is, how do you get it done?
Yeah, I mean, I think the top priority is quality education for all, right? I think families, just, having grown up in Bed-Stuy and having raised my children in Bed-Stuy, quite frankly, I was less concerned about the diversity in the classroom than I was about the quality of instruction. That to me was the most important thing. And so I think that if people are getting quality instruction, the desegregation thing is still really important, but it becomes kind of, it's easy to sort of push that to number two. I think right now the problem is that quality instruction and desegregation seem so linked, right? Because and this is not to disparage teachers in particular communities, because I understand that teachers are doing the best that they can. It goes to the idea of this being a systemic and structural thing, right? In terms of resources and supports.
So your focus is more on resources than redrawing district lines, for example.
Absolutely. I think equitable, funding is critical, and full funding for schools is important. And that would be a priority for me.
I have two final questions in our last minute here. So they both have to be brief, but that's okay. They're designed that way. One is, if you had to give Mayor Bill de Blasio a letter grade and a very brief sort of rationale, what would it be?
So I think, 18 months ago, it might have been a B. And now it's very different. Now I think he's failing our communities. I feel like he checked out a long time ago and is not connecting or listening or responding to the true communities of New York City in a way that we need during this crisis.
And lastly, do you have a role model in politics, or I guess otherwise, but maybe in politics, if you could stick to that, in terms of, whose politics align with yours and at least to some extent, not fully necessarily, but, do you have a role model in politics that you try to emulate, or is a guidepost for you?
I am a particular fan of Auntie Maxine. I think her sort of
Maxine Waters.
Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Mhm.
She's been steadfast and clear and kind of unapologetic. And then, I have to be honest that on a sort of more sort of recent level, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been absolutely inspiring in terms of her commitment to just, calling it as she sees it and not backing down.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Dianne Morales. I appreciate the time. It's good to talk with you. We'll talk more as the campaign unfolds.
Thank you so much, Ben. Have a great one.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming up in June and the fall. There's a lot on the line for all of us and the future of our city. I hope this conversation and others are helpful. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.